Never thought I'd be the kind of person who had to sit down and tell a story like this. But when your entire life gets turned upside down by people who are supposed to protect the neighborhood, you realize that silence only helps them. I bought my home because of the creek. Not because of the oversized kitchen, not because of the vaulted ceilings, and not even because of the quiet cul-de-sac where kids rode their bikes until dark. It was that small, winding creek behind my property, the one that trickled over stones in the spring and shimmered gold in the fall, that made me sign my name on the dotted line. You see, that creek wasn't just pretty to look at. It was part of the reason the land was stable. It carried off rainwater every storm, channeled it gently down into the wetlands, and kept the whole area safe. Every neighbor who'd lived here long enough knew it. The kids played near it. Families set up hammocks beside it. And when you sat out on your porch at night, you could hear the water like a soft whisper, as if the earth itself was alive. But beauty has a way of attracting jealousy, and security has a way of making greedy people careless. The Ho, the very same group of men and women who held themselves up as guardians of the neighborhood, saw that creek not as a lifeline, but as a nuisance. At first, it was small things, complaints about mosquitoes, a fuss over how fallen branches made it look messy. Then came the letters, vague warnings about maintenance responsibilities and aesthetic standards. I ignored them because who in their right mind would call a natural creek ugly? But ignoring them was my first mistake. The president of the Ho, a man named Gerald, lived in the biggest house on the block. He had a brick facade, a three-car garage, and the kind of smile that was more about showing teeth than showing kindness. He didn't buy his home for peace or beauty. He bought it because he wanted control. And people like him always find ways to get it. One spring, after a heavy rainstorm, he called an emergency meeting in the community clubhouse. I'll never forget how he slammed his fist on the table, pointing toward me like I was some criminal. "That creek," he said, voice booming, "is a liability. It floods. It invites pests. And if we don't do something now, every one of our property values will plummet." Neighbors murmured, some nodding along, others looking at me with pity. I tried to explain. The creek wasn't the problem. It was the solution. It drained the land. It prevented floods. But Gerald had already made up his mind. And when Gerald made up his mind, the Ho followed. 2 weeks later, trucks arrived. Not the small kind you rent from a hardware store, but massive machines with steel claws and concrete mixers. I came home from work to the sound of engines roaring and the sight of workers in orange vests dragging pipes and boards toward the water. My heart sank as I realized what was happening. They were filling the creek. I shouted. I begged. I even stood in front of one of the machines, arms outstretched. But the foreman waved a paper in my face, a permit signed by the whole board, declaring this an improvement project. I called the county. I called the city. Each time, I was told the same thing. If your Ho voted on it and paid for it, it's legal. Legal. That word has never sounded so dirty to me. For days, I watched them pour concrete where water once danced. The creek, my creek, vanished under gray sludge. The trickling music of water silenced by the hiss of cement hardening in the sun. And when the last truck pulled away, I stood at the edge of what was now a scar through my backyard, a thick, gray wall where life used to be. Gerald called it progress. The Ho newsletter declared it a long-term investment in neighborhood stability. But deep down, I knew better. You don't kill a creek and expect the land to forgive you. At first, everything looked fine. Grass grew neatly around the concrete trench. Neighbors clapped each other on the back, proud of their decision. They believed they'd tamed nature, bent it to their will. But nature doesn't forget, and it certainly doesn't forgive. The first sign came 3 months later, during summer. Rainwater, once carried away by the creek, had nowhere to go. Lawns that had been flat and firm now bubbled like sponges after storms. The air smelled faintly of mildew. Houses that had stood proud for decades now groaned under the weight of shifting foundations. And me? I sat on my porch and watched, powerless as the neighborhood transformed. My sanctuary became a swamp. Neighbors stopped waving when they saw me. Gerald told everyone I was exaggerating and trying to stir up drama. But at night, when the crickets chirped louder than usual, you could hear it. The faint gurgle of trapped water seeping under the soil, looking for a way out. The Ho thought they'd won, but in reality, they'd started a war with the land itself. And in a war like that, the earth always finds a way to strike back. I remember the night it began in earnest. A storm rolled in, heavier than anything we'd had in years. Rain slammed against rooftops. Lightning cracked so close you could smell the ozone. I stood at my window, heart pounding, and watched as water pooled on every lawn, climbing higher and higher until it spilled into driveways. Then, with a sickening creak, one of the million-dollar homes, the pristine white one with stone pillars and a circular driveway, shifted. I swear, it leaned like a drunk staggering home. The ground beneath it had turned to soup, and the foundation cracked with a sound that echoed across the street. By morning, the HOA's dream of progress was drowning before their eyes. But that was only the beginning. Morning came like a cruel spotlight after the storm. Clouds still hung heavy in the sky, bruised purple and gray, dripping the last of the rain onto a neighborhood that looked nothing like the one we'd moved into. Where there used to be neat lawns, trimmed hedges, and driveways you could eat off of, there were now puddles deep enough to swallow children's bikes. The sidewalks were slick, the air was thick with the smell of wet earth, and in the middle of it all stood Gerald, our fearless Ho president, hands on his hips as if he could glare the water into retreat. But the water didn't care. The White House across the street, the one that had shifted in the night, now looked like a crime scene. Its front porch sagged on one side, the stone pillars cracked in spiderweb lines that spread farther every time the ground beneath groaned. Neighbors gathered at a distance, whispering like parishioners at a funeral. Some filmed on their phones, because that's what people do now when their world is falling apart. They record it, as if proof will somehow shield them from reality. I stood apart from them, arms crossed, soaked to the skin from checking the back of my property. The creek, my creek, should have carried away this storm. It should have been roaring with life, the water tumbling and foaming as it raced toward the wetlands. Instead, it was entombed beneath that ribbon of concrete, like a body buried alive. And now the water, with nowhere to go, was rising. Gerald spotted me and stormed over, his shoes splashing through ankle-deep puddles. "You happy?" he barked, jabbing a finger at me. "You've been predicting doom since the day we fixed this place, and now look, everyone's in a panic because you can't stop spreading nonsense." I laughed, bitter and sharp. "Nonsense? That house is sinking. The land is waterlogged. This is exactly what I warned you about. It's temporary," he snapped, though I could see the flicker of doubt in his eyes. "We'll call in drainage experts, landscapers, whoever it takes. We're not going to let a little water ruin this community." A little water. That's what he called it, standing in the middle of what was quickly becoming a swamp. But denial only lasts so long when the ground under your feet is dissolving. By noon, the first truck arrived. A contractor the Ho had called, and a group of men in neon vests and rubber boots waded through the mess, muttering to each other, measuring, testing. I hung back, pretending not to listen, but every word carried across the open yards. Subsoils saturated, drainage systems overwhelmed, concrete's acting like a dam. One of them shook his head, spitting rainwater from his lips. "You can't fight nature like this. Whoever thought filling in a creek was a good idea should have their license revoked." I wanted to shout, to throw their own words back at the board. But I didn't. Not yet. Sometimes the truth doesn't need your voice. It's loud enough on its own. By the second day, the swamp wasn't just outside anymore. It had crept inside the homes. Basements flooded, carpet squished beneath footsteps, and sump pumps groaned until they burned out. The air turned sour, heavy with the smell of mold blooming in the walls. And still, Gerald refused to admit defeat. I remember the emergency meeting he called that evening, held in the same clubhouse where he'd first declared the creek a liability. The irony was thick. The clubhouse itself reeked of dampness, and water pooled at the corners of the carpet. Neighbors sat on folding chairs, pale and anxious. Some were furious, others on the verge of tears. Gerald stood at the front, chin raised like a general rallying troops. "We're facing challenges, yes," he said, "but challenges can be overcome. The board is already in contact with engineers. Insurance will cover much of the damage. What matters is that we stay united." United, that word tasted foul. When he opened the floor, voices exploded. "My basement's a lake. My kids are coughing from the mold already. You told us this would protect our homes." Gerald raised his hands, trying to calm them, but the anger was too sharp, too raw. And then, like a blade sliding between ribs, someone spoke the truth that silenced the room. "This all started when you destroyed the creek." All eyes turned to me. For months I'd been painted as the troublemaker, the alarmist, the crank who couldn't let go of a little stream. But now, in the wet silence of that clubhouse, the truth was undeniable. I rose slowly, my voice low but steady. "You killed the creek. You thought concrete was stronger than water. But water doesn't stop. It doesn't forget. You dammed it up, and now it's damming up your lives. And until you admit what you've done, this will only get worse." For the first time, Gerald didn't have an answer. His face flushed red, his mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping on land, but no sound came out. That night, I lay awake listening, not to the peaceful trickle I'd once known, but to the sinister gurgle beneath the earth. Water was moving, searching, and it was only a matter of time before it found its revenge. By the end of the week, the neighborhood looked like something out of a disaster documentary. Lawns were submerged, driveways cracked, and the million-dollar homes, the pride of the community, leaned at angles that made them look like broken teeth in a rotting jaw. Insurance adjusters came, shaking their heads. Contractors stopped showing up. The HOA, once so full of bluster, now avoided eye contact, their voices hushed as if afraid the land itself might be listening. But I wasn't afraid anymore. I was angry, because this wasn't just about homes or property values. This was about respect for the land, for the balance we'd destroyed. And deep down, I knew the swamp would only grow hungrier. And when it did, it wouldn't just swallow our houses. It would swallow our lives. Morning sunlight used to mean peace in this neighborhood. When I first moved in, you'd hear the birds chirping, sprinklers ticking across green lawns, and the sound of coffee cups clinking on porches. But after the storm, morning sunlight only revealed the damage that the night had done. It was like watching a stage play where the spotlight illuminated broken props, sagging curtains, and terrified actors who no longer knew their lines. By now, every single one of us was living in a swamp. Driveways shimmered with standing water, like shallow lakes reflecting the sagging silhouettes of million-dollar homes. Kids who used to race each other to the bus stop now had to tiptoe over planks their parents laid across puddles. The air smelled of mold and stagnant water, clinging to everything, even the back of your throat. I walked my yard in rubber boots, each step sinking slightly, water bubbling around the edges. It was supposed to be my sanctuary, my little slice of heaven anchored by that creek. Instead, it felt like quicksand, as though the earth was warning me that any wrong step could swallow me whole. And the worst part, the HOA still hadn't admitted their mistake. Gerald called another meeting that morning, this time at his own house. He claimed the clubhouse was undergoing repairs, but everyone knew the truth. The stench of mold inside had become unbearable. So we gathered in his living room, where the smell of expensive candles tried and failed to mask the mildew creeping up the drywall. I'll never forget the scene. Gerald stood in front of the fireplace, arms folded, trying to project authority. His wife, a thin woman with sharp eyes and sharper words, passed around bottled water like we were guests instead of victims. Neighbors filled the couches, chairs, even the stairs, murmuring among themselves. Everyone looked tired. Not the normal kind of tired, but the kind that seeps into your bones when you realize your world might never go back to the way it was. "Thank you all for coming," Gerald began, his voice practiced, polished. I want to assure you that the board is doing everything in its power to resolve this situation. We've contacted multiple contractors and engineers. We're negotiating with the county. This is temporary. Temporary? A woman near the back scoffed. She was clutching a toddler on her hip, his nose running, eyes red from allergies or maybe mold. My basement's been underwater for a week. My son's been sick since this started. Temporary doesn't cut it. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. Gerald held up his hands. I understand your frustration, but panicking won't help. We need unity. That word again. Unity. I leaned forward in my chair, my voice cutting through the noise. Unity is what got us into this mess. You all voted with him. You let him kill the creek. And now we're paying the price. A silence fell. Dozens of eyes turned toward me, some angry, some ashamed, some just desperate for someone to blame. Gerald's jaw tightened. This isn't the time for finger-pointing, isn't it? I shot back. Because if we don't start pointing fingers, if we don't start acknowledging what caused this, we're just going to keep sinking, literally. The room erupted. Voices overlapped. He's right, Gerald. You said this would raise property values. My insurance company won't even cover flood damage. They say it's our own fault. I can't even sell my house now. Who would buy it? Gerald's wife snapped. That's enough. But no one listened. The illusion of control had cracked. And once a crack starts, it spreads. That was the moment the first lawsuit was mentioned. A man in a blue polo shirt, face red with anger, stood and pointed at Gerald. I'm filing against the HOA. You made this decision without proper consultation. You cost me thousands already. Gasps, murmurs, a rush of whispers followed. It was like a spark catching dry brush. Suddenly, everyone was talking about lawyers, lawsuits, liability. For months, the HOA had acted like an untouchable empire. Now, it was being treated like a collapsing business, and Gerald was the CEO about to be thrown to the wolves. But Gerald, stubborn as ever, refused to break. If you sue the HOA, he thundered, you're suing yourselves. We're all members. That money you're after, it comes out of community funds. It comes out of your pockets, too. That silenced them for a moment. He was right, technically. But fear has a way of outweighing logic. And right then, fear was everywhere. I watched him carefully, saw the sweat glistening at his temples, the twitch in his jaw. He wasn't invincible anymore. He was cornered. And a cornered man is dangerous. The meeting dissolved into chaos, neighbors shouting over one another, some storming out, others staying to argue. I slipped out quietly, needing air. The swamp smell clung to me as I walked home, but beneath it was something worse, the smell of rot. Not just from mold, but from the decay of trust, of community. That night, I sat on my porch and listened again. The water was restless, murmuring beneath the concrete like a prisoner banging on the walls of its cell. I closed my eyes and imagined it black, swirling, hungry. It wasn't just waiting to reclaim its path. It was waiting to consume anyone foolish enough to stand in its way. And I couldn't shake the feeling that Gerald had just painted a target on his own back. The next morning proved me right. I woke to shouting outside, voices sharp and frantic. Throwing on boots, I hurried to the street and found a crowd gathered at Gerald's house. His pristine lawn was gone, replaced by a shallow pond that lapped at the steps of his front porch. The ground had given way during the night, and the water had rushed in like it was claiming its victory. Gerald stood in the doorway, pale and shaking, his wife clutching his arm. For the first time, I saw real fear in his eyes. Not anger, not arrogance, fear. This is sabotage, he screamed at the crowd. Someone's trying to destroy me. No, I said quietly, though everyone heard. That's not sabotage. That's nature, Gerald. And you should have respected it, the crowd muttered. Some nodded. Some looked away. But none defended him. The king had lost his crown. Over the next week, things only worsened. Insurance companies refused claims, citing negligent modification of natural waterways. Contractors stopped answering calls. The county washed its hands of us, saying the Ho had taken full responsibility when it approved the creek project. And slowly, neighbors began to turn on each other. Whispers of selling homes under the table, arguments about who should pay for repairs. Fists nearly thrown over accusations of siding with Gerald. What once was a neighborhood became a battlefield. And in the middle of it all, the swamp spread wider. I started keeping a journal then, not just to record what was happening, but to remind myself that I wasn't crazy. Every day, the ground sank lower. Every storm brought more standing water. And every night, the earth seemed to groan beneath us, like something ancient and angry was waking up. Because here's the thing. You can pour concrete over a creek. You can bury it, silence it, pretend it's gone. But water always finds a way. Always. And the longer you try to hold it back, the more violent its revenge becomes. It's strange how fast a neighborhood can fall apart. One month we were smiling at each other across driveways, borrowing sugar, waving at kids as they biked past. The next, we were enemies, glaring through rain-streaked windows, whispering behind closed doors, waiting for the next blow to fall. The blow came in the form of paper. It started with a single lawsuit, filed by the man in the blue polo shirt, the one who had stood up to Gerald during the meeting. He claimed the Ho had failed in its duty to protect property values and had instead deliberately caused catastrophic damage. His attorney didn't waste time. Letters were sent, court dates threatened, and suddenly the phrase class action was hanging in the air like smoke from a fire. Within a week, 5 more homeowners filed their own suits. Some joined together, some went solo, but all of them named the Ho as the culprit. And by extension, they named Gerald. I watched it unfold like a slow-motion train wreck. Neighbors who used to chat about holiday decorations now avoided each other at the mailbox. Every conversation was laced with suspicion. Are you suing? Are you siding with him? Are you trying to sink the whole neighborhood just to save yourself? And all the while, the swamp crept closer. Gerald tried to keep up appearances. He drove around in his shiny SUV, rolled down his window, and shouted half-hearted reassurances about plans in motion and experts on the way. But his words carried less weight each day. His own yard had turned into a lagoon, the water line inching up his driveway like a predator stalking prey. One night, I couldn't sleep. The croak of frogs and the hum of mosquitoes outside my window were louder than usual, like a living chorus mocking what we'd become. I stepped out onto my porch, flashlight in hand, and scanned the yards. That's when I saw Gerald. He was standing ankle-deep in the water that had claimed his lawn, staring at the cracked remains of his driveway. His shoulders slumped, his head hung low. For the first time, he didn't look like the arrogant president of the Ho. He looked like a man who had finally realized the monster he'd unleashed. I almost pitied him. Almost. The lawsuits weren't the only problem. The banks were circling too. Word had spread about the flooding, and home values plummeted. People who had taken out massive loans to buy their dream homes now found themselves underwater, financially and literally. For sale signs began popping up, but they were more like tombstones than invitations. Nobody wanted to buy into a swamp. Realtors stopped returning calls. That's when the finger-pointing turned violent. I was outside one afternoon checking my foundation for cracks when shouting erupted 2 houses down. I rushed over and found 2 men in each other's faces, veins bulging, fists clenched. One accused the other of sabotaging his sump pump. The other swore it was nonsense. Their wives screamed at each other from the porches. Kids cried from inside. By the time Gerald showed up, red-faced and sweating, it was too late. The fight had already spilled into the waterlogged street, fists flying, mud splashing. Neighbors dragged them apart, but the damage was done. The thin thread holding the community together had snapped. And all the while, the swamp crept closer. The worst storm yet hit 2 days later. Sheets of rain hammered the roofs. Thunder rattled the windows, and wind tore branches from trees. I sat by my front door, watching the water rise higher than I'd ever seen. It poured over driveways, swallowed mailboxes, and turned the entire cul-de-sac into a shimmering lake. Then came the cracking sound. It was sharp, loud, unmistakable, the sound of a foundation giving way. I grabbed my flashlight and ran to the street, heart pounding. Neighbors were already gathering in the downpour, their faces pale with fear. And there it was. The massive stone front house at the corner, the pride of the block, was sinking. Water surged around it, gnawing at the ground like teeth. The porch collapsed in a roar of splintering wood. Windows shattered, sending shards across the yard. And then, in the blink of an eye, the entire left side of the house caved in, dragged down into the mud by the weight of its own arrogance. People screamed. Kids cried. Someone shouted for the fire department, but we all knew it was pointless. No siren could stop what had started. I stood there, soaked to the bone, watching as the swamp swallowed another monument to wealth and pride. My chest felt tight, not from fear, but from a grim, bitter sense of justice. This was what Gerald and his board had brought on us. This was what happened when you thought you could cage nature and strip it of its power. The next morning, the news crews arrived. Cameras rolled, microphones shoved into faces, reporters speaking in tones that swung between pity and sensationalism. Luxury neighborhood becomes swamp nightmare. $1 million homes collapse after whole project backfires. The world was watching now, and there was no hiding. Gerald tried, of course. He stood in front of the cameras, drenched in rainwater, insisting that steps were being taken and solutions were in motion. But behind him, the image told the truth, a neighborhood drowning in its own hubris. The lawsuits multiplied. County officials finally came to inspect, but instead of help, they brought warnings and citations. The HOA had violated environmental codes, they said. They had interfered with natural waterways without proper permits. Fines were looming, and potential criminal charges hung in the air like thunderclouds. The neighbors who once worshipped Gerald now turned on him like wolves. His porch became a gathering point not for admiration, but for shouting matches, threats, demands. His once perfect lawn was a trampled mess of mud and footprints, a symbol of his fallen kingdom. And through it all, I kept listening. Every night, the water murmured beneath the concrete, louder now, more insistent. It was as if the earth itself was speaking, promising that this wasn't over, that the swamp hadn't claimed its final victim yet. I realized then that this wasn't just about homes or lawsuits. This was about balance. The creek had been the neighborhood's artery, pumping life and stability through the land. By burying it, we had strangled the heart of the place. And now, the body was rotting from the inside out. But the swamp wasn't done teaching us its lesson. Not yet. Because the next storm wouldn't just take a house. It would take people. I used to believe disasters happened in sudden moments. 1 second life was fine, the next it wasn't. But living in this swamp taught me the truth. Disasters creep. They seep into your walls like mold, into your air like humidity, into your sleep like nightmares. You don't realize how deep you're in until the ground gives way beneath your feet. And by then, it's too late. By the time the 5th storm rolled through, the neighborhood wasn't just in trouble. It was broken. Every home bore scars. Sinking porches, leaning fences, cracked sidewalks, and basements that smelled like death. The place looked like an abandoned town, even though people still lived there, like ghosts haunting their own investments. The HOA was still meeting, though fewer people showed up each time. The last gathering was held in the remains of the clubhouse, where the carpet squelched with every step, and the ceiling tiles sagged with trapped rainwater. Gerald stood at the front with his usual false confidence, but his voice no longer filled the room. It trembled. It cracked. "We've contacted 3 more contractors," he said, gripping the podium as if it could keep him from sinking too. "They'll assess the situation and propose solutions. We're also negotiating with the county for emergency relief funding." A hand shot up from the back. It was Marjorie, an elderly woman who had lived here longer than most. Her voice, usually gentle, was sharp as broken glass. "And how exactly are you paying for that, Gerald?" "The whole fund is empty. My dues, everyone's dues, They're gone. You spent them filling in the creek. Murmurs erupted. Someone shouted, "Yeah, where's the money, Gerald?" Another barked, "We're not giving you another dime." Gerald slammed his palm on the podium. "We are in this together. If you refuse to contribute, the neighborhood collapses." That was the wrong word to use, collapses, because that was exactly what was happening outside. That night, the storm wasn't the worst we'd had, but it was the straw that broke the camel's back. I woke to the sound of sirens, not rain. Flashing lights painted my walls red and blue. I stumbled outside in boots and a raincoat, joining the crowd already gathered at the corner. Another house had gone. Not in slow motion this time, not piece by piece. The storm had weakened the ground so much that the entire structure slid, as if swallowed whole. One moment it stood proud, the next it tilted, groaned, and dropped into the mud like a stone into water. The screams were real this time, not the shrieks of frightened neighbors, but of people inside. A family hadn't evacuated. I can still hear it now, the father's voice bellowing for help, the children crying, the crash of furniture as the house disintegrated around them. Firefighters waded in waist-deep water, shouting orders, dragging ladders. Neighbors formed lines, passing buckets, ropes, anything that might help. I joined them, my hands trembling as I pulled at debris. But the mud was stronger than us. It sucked everything down, greedy and merciless. By dawn, 2 people were confirmed dead, a child and his mother. The neighborhood was no longer a story about property values. It was a story about graves. The news vans multiplied. Helicopters hovered overhead, their blades chopping the air like knives. Reporters swarmed us, thrusting cameras in faces, asking, "Do you blame the HOA? Do you plan to leave? Do you feel safe here?" Safe. That word had lost all meaning. The lawsuits surged after that. Families who lost loved ones hired attorneys with teeth. Words like manslaughter and criminal negligence appeared in headlines. The HOA was no longer just a failing organization. It was a defendant, an accused killer. And Gerald? He unraveled before our eyes. I saw him one evening, pacing in his yard, or what was left of it. His once perfect lawn was a swampy wasteland, his ornamental shrubs half drowned. He clutched his phone, shouting into it, "No, you listen to me. I don't care what the papers say. We had approval. It was legal. Legal." He still clung to that word like it was a life raft. But the raft had holes. His wife stopped being seen in public. Curtains drawn, lights off. Rumor was she'd taken the kids to stay with her sister. Couldn't blame her. Gerald was radioactive now. No one wanted to be near him. The board members who once stood proudly beside him now avoided his gaze, some resigning quietly, others disappearing altogether. The whole newsletter stopped arriving. The mandatory meetings ceased. It was as if the empire had crumbled, leaving only Gerald behind, a king with no crown, no court, and no kingdom. But the swamp didn't care about politics. It kept spreading. My backyard, once lush and steady, now squelched like a sponge. The fence leaned so badly, I had to tear part of it down before it fell. Inside, my basement was damp, the walls stained with creeping mold, no matter how often I scrubbed. The air purifiers hummed day and night, but the smell lingered, earthy, sour, inescapable. One night, as I tried to sleep, I heard it again. That gurgle, that muffled roar beneath the ground. It was louder now, almost like laughter, as if the water itself knew it was winning. And maybe it was. Neighbors began fleeing. Some packed U-Hauls in the dead of night, driving away without goodbyes. Others simply abandoned their homes, leaving curtains fluttering in broken windows, toys scattered on flooded lawns. Within weeks, our pristine cul-de-sac looked like a ghost town. But not me. I couldn't leave. This was still my home, broken as it was. This was still my land. The creek had been mine before Gerald's concrete strangled it, and I wasn't going to abandon it now. I started documenting everything: videos, photos, journals. Every crack, Every flood, every night, the water rose higher. Not because I thought I could win a lawsuit, but because I wanted proof. Proof that we had been warned, that nature had given us signs, and that we'd ignored them until it was too late. The strangest thing happened then. People started coming to me. Neighbors who once avoided me, who called me crazy, now stood at my porch with tears in their eyes, begging for advice. What do we do? Can we fix it? Is it too late? I didn't know how to answer. I wasn't an engineer, wasn't a lawyer. I was just a man who loved a creek. But I told them the truth anyway. It's too late to undo what was done. All we can do now is survive it. And survival became the only goal. Some dug trenches around their homes, desperate to redirect the water. Others stacked sandbags, built makeshift levees. It was useless, of course. The swamp didn't care about sandbags, but it gave them something to do, something to fight for, even if the fight was already lost. Then came the night that ended everything. The storm rolled in without warning. Black skies, violent wind, rain that fell in sheets so heavy you couldn't see 5 feet ahead. The power went out almost immediately, plunging the neighborhood into darkness. The only light came from lightning, each flash revealing water rising faster than ever before. I stood at my window, flashlight in hand, watching as my yard disappeared. The fence vanished. The driveway became a river. Across the street, I saw Gerald's silhouette, standing in his doorway, water swirling at his knees. For a moment, our eyes met. Lightning lit his face, twisted with fear and something else, acceptance. Then came the roar. It was deep, guttural, like the earth itself was splitting open. The concrete that had once buried the creek cracked, split, and gave way. Water exploded upward, furious and unstoppable, reclaiming its path with a vengeance centuries in the making. The swamp was no longer creeping. It was here, and it wanted everything. When dawn finally broke, it didn't feel like morning. It felt like the world had been gutted, its bones left scattered under a gray sky. The storm had spent the night tearing at everything we had left, and now the silence that followed was deafening. No birds sang, no dogs barked, just the steady drip of water from broken gutters, the distant creak of wood warped beyond recognition, and the low hiss of wind dragging through a drowned community. I stepped outside into knee-high water, flashlight still clutched in my fist though the sun was up. My boots sank into the soft muck of what used to be my front yard. The smell was unbearable, a mix of rot, gasoline, and earth ripped raw. Where there had once been homes worth $500,000, there were skeletons. Walls tilted at impossible angles, roofs sagging, windows shattered and gaping like empty eyes. Furniture floated in the streets. Mattresses, children's toys, someone's wedding album. Everything that had been private, personal, sacred, it was all out here now, water-logged and ruined. I made my way down the cul-de-sac. Every step was a fight. I stumbled past what had been the Johnsons' house, now nothing but a heap of siding and timber. The swing set in their backyard was gone, carried away who knows where. Next came the Rodriguez place. Half the house had simply vanished, swallowed overnight. The silence was worst of all. No kids riding bikes. No sprinklers hissing. No neighbors yelling across fences. Just the wet slap of water and the occasional groan of a house on the verge of collapse. Then I saw Gerald. He was sitting on the clubhouse steps, or what was left of them, soaked through, mud streaking his face. His crisp polo shirt was torn, and for the first time since I'd known him, his hair was wild, uncombed. He didn't look like the smug president of an HOA anymore. He looked like a man who had lost everything. When he noticed me, his eyes narrowed. His voice cracked, ragged from shouting all night. "You happy now?" I stopped. "What? This is what you wanted, isn't it?" He spat, his hands trembling. "You fought us every step of the way. You undermined us. You made people doubt. Now look around. This is on you too." I felt the heat rise in my chest. On me? I begged you not to touch the creek. I warned you over and over. And you I pointed at the ruins around us. You filled it with concrete. You buried the one thing that kept this place alive. His laugh was hollow, bitter. Kept it alive? That creek was an eyesore, a liability. We were trying to raise property values. I stepped closer, water rippling around my legs. And instead, you buried us all. For a moment, he looked like he might argue again. But then his shoulders sagged. The fight drained from his face. He stared down at his mud-caked hands, whispering something too quiet to hear. It was the first time I realized Gerald wasn't just stubborn. He was broken. But broken or not, the damage was done. Behind us, sirens wailed. Emergency crews pushed through what was left of the main road, boats in tow. Men in neon vests shouted orders, guiding survivors toward higher ground. People stumbled out of their homes, or what remained, clutching whatever they had managed to save. A bag of clothes, a single photo frame, a dog trembling in their arms. I helped where I could. I carried supplies, pulled an elderly neighbor into one of the boats, steadied a young mother with a crying toddler on her hip. Every face I saw was the same. Empty, hollow, stunned. We were refugees now, not homeowners. Hours passed. The neighborhood emptied. Rescue teams declared the area unsafe, warning of more collapses, more sinkholes. They begged us to leave. Most listened. Some didn't. I stayed. Not because I thought I could save my house. It was already half lost. But because walking away felt like betrayal. This land had been mine long before it became a subdivision. That creek had been part of me. If I left, I feared I'd never forgive myself. By afternoon, the reporters came. Vans rolled up on higher ground, satellites pointed skyward, cameras aimed at the devastation. They swarmed survivors with microphones, asking the same questions over and over. How did this happen? Who's to blame? What happens next? Gerald tried to face them. I watched him stumble into the crowd, voice hoarse as he shouted about natural disasters and unprecedented rainfall. He tried to spin it the way he always had. Tried to shift blame, wrap the story in neat little lies. But this time, no one believed him. One reporter held up documents, home meeting minutes, old contracts, emails leaked by someone on the board. Proof. Proof that the creek had been deliberately filled against multiple warnings. Proof that Gerald had pushed the project forward despite objections, ignoring permits, ignoring safety codes. When the reporter read his own words aloud, Gerald froze. His mouth opened, closed, opened again, but no sound came out. The cameras caught everything, the sweat dripping down his temple, the wild look in his eyes, the moment he realized he was finished. The footage aired that night on every major channel. Oh, negligence turns million-dollar neighborhood into swamp. 2 dead, dozens displaced, homeowners left with nothing. Creek filled with concrete at center of catastrophic collapse. Gerald's name was everywhere. Lawsuits stacked higher than sandbags. Criminal investigations launched. His reputation, his finances, his family, gone. But justice, if you could call it that, felt empty. Because no matter how many headlines screamed his guilt, the water didn't recede. The homes didn't rise from the mud. The families didn't come back. We were still drowning. That night, as I sat on my porch with a lantern flickering beside me, I listened to the swamp. The frogs croaked. Mosquitoes buzzed thick in the air. Somewhere far off, I heard wood crack and collapse into the water. I thought about the creek, the way it used to flow, alive and free. I thought about how it had been silenced, smothered, until it fought back with a vengeance. And I thought about us, about how we'd done the same thing to ourselves. Smothered our instincts, silenced our doubts, buried warnings under layers of concrete lies. The swamp wasn't just outside anymore. It was in us. And it wasn't finished. The weeks that followed blurred together, like rain smearing ink across paper. One storm bled into another, one collapse into the next, until the neighborhood no longer felt like a place where people lived. It felt like a memory, a ghost town suspended between what it had been and what it was becoming. When the rescue crews left, silence took over again. Not the calm kind of silence you hear in a forest, alive with hidden life. This was the silence of rot, of things falling apart. Every morning I woke to a new sound of failure. The groan of a wall giving way, the splash of a deck sinking beneath the water, the hollow crash of a fence collapsing into mud. Insurance adjusters came next. They trudged through the muck in rubber boots, clipboards in hand, taking photographs, making notes. People clung to them like lifelines, desperate for promises. But promises never came. Instead, letters began to arrive. Cold, clinical denials typed in black ink. Damage due to flooding is not covered. Negligence on part of HOA absolves policy responsibility. Loss declared uninsurable due to prior alterations of land. Families who had lost everything now faced the final blow. They weren't just homeless. They were penniless. No compensation. No recovery. Just debt and memories of what once was. I saw Mrs. Johnson break down right there on her porch, clutching the letter in her fist until the paper tore. She screamed at the adjuster, her voice raw. We paid every premium. Every single one. You can't just walk away. The man lowered his eyes, muttered something about policy limitations, and left. The Rodriguezes packed what little they could into their car and drove off at dawn one morning, their children silent in the back seat. I watched them go, knowing they weren't coming back. Others followed. Some boarded up windows, others simply locked doors and left keys swinging in deadbolts. Within a month, half the neighborhood was gone. Houses sat empty, their driveways overgrown with weeds, mail piling up in soggy boxes. Vines crept along siding, ivy scaling shutters. The swamp wasted no time in claiming its prize. Frogs nested in basements, snakes slithered through collapsed crawlspaces, birds built nests in broken gutters. What the storm hadn't destroyed, nature would. And yet, I stayed. Friends called me a fool. My sister begged me to leave, told me to sell what I could, move in with her, start fresh. But how do you start fresh when your roots run this deep? This land wasn't just property to me. It was blood, sweat, history. The creek had been part of my childhood, its song echoing through summers and winters long before there was ever a subdivision here. I couldn't abandon it. Not yet. But staying wasn't easy. Every night, I lit lanterns because the power grid was unreliable, wires sagging in flooded soil. I boiled water before drinking it, the taps reeking of sulfur. My meals were simple, canned goods, bread that went stale too quickly, vegetables I tried to salvage from a garden that drowned more with each passing rain. The loneliness was worse than the hunger. The laughter of children, the chatter of barbecues, the sound of neighbors mowing lawns, all gone. In their place came the constant hum of insects, the croak of frogs, the splash of unseen creatures in dark water. I'd lie awake, listening to them, wondering if the swamp was whispering, telling me I didn't belong anymore. One night, I heard footsteps outside my window. My chest tightened. For a moment, I thought it was looters. Word had spread about abandoned homes filled with valuables. But when I peered out, I saw Gerald. He was wading through the water, flashlight shaking in his hand. His clothes were dirty, hair matted, eyes hollow. He looked like a man unmoored, drifting between reality and madness. I stepped onto my porch. Gerald. He froze, then slowly turned. His voice was barely a whisper. They're watching me. I frowned. Who? He pointed toward the swamp, his hand trembling. The water. The land. It wants me gone. My throat went dry. Part of me wanted to laugh, to dismiss it as delirium. But another part of me, the part that had listened to the creek roar in the dead of night, knew he wasn't entirely wrong. Go home, Gerald, I said gently. He shook his head. There is no home. Not anymore. And then he disappeared into the darkness, his flashlight bobbing until it vanished behind the curtain of reeds. I didn't see him again for days. When I finally did, it was in the news. They said he'd been arrested, charged with negligence, fraud, reckless endangerment. The Ho president, who once ruled with arrogance, was now a defendant in a courtroom. His empire of concrete lies crumbled to dust. Neighbors celebrated the news. Some said justice had finally been served. But to me, it felt hollow. Because no matter how many years Gerald might spend behind bars, the swamp remained. The neighborhood was transforming faster now. With fewer people left to fight it, nature surged. Trees sprouted in cracked driveways. Moss blanketed brick walls. Cattails grew tall where mailboxes once stood. The creek, free at last, had carved new channels, splitting lawns in half, turning cul-de-sacs into islands. It was beautiful in a terrible way, like watching a predator devour prey, gruesome but inevitable. One evening, I sat on my porch with a notebook in hand, trying to capture it all. My pen scratched across the page. This is not destruction. This is reclamation. The swamp isn't killing us. It's reminding us we were never in charge. As the sun set, painting the water gold, I realized something. Maybe staying wasn't about fighting anymore. Maybe it was about witnessing. Bearing witness to what happens when arrogance meets nature, when greed tries to bury rivers and silence earth. Someone had to remember. Someone had to tell the story. And so I stayed, even as the nights grew darker, even as the water crept higher, even as the swamp whispered louder. I stayed, because deep down, I knew this story wasn't finished. Not yet. When you are the last one left in a place that used to be full of life, the silence doesn't just surround you, it gets inside you. It changes the rhythm of your heartbeat. It bends the shape of your thoughts. You start to hear things that may not even be there. It had been months since the storm that broke us. Most of my neighbors were long gone, scattered to relatives' homes, rented apartments, motels 2 counties over. Some went willingly, others kicking and screaming, but they all went. Even the stubborn ones eventually caved when the insurance denials piled up, when the mold crept too far, when the walls groaned one time too many in the dead of night. But not me. I stayed. And with each passing week, I felt myself becoming part of the swamp. The neighborhood, if you could still call it that, was almost unrecognizable. Driveways vanished underwater. Cul-de-sacs turned into ponds. Mailboxes rusted and leaned like gravestones. Whole streets were impassable now, choked with cattails and murky pools where snakes curled. Every morning, I'd walk the ruins with my boots strapped tight, machete in hand to cut through reeds. I'd check the old houses, not because I expected anyone to be inside, but because I couldn't let go of the habit. Once I found a child's toy floating near the Rodriguez's place, a little red fire truck, paint peeling, wheels spinning slowly in the water, as if still searching for someone to rescue. Other times, I found less innocent things. Broken beer bottles from looters. Graffiti scrawled across the Johnson's garage. Nature wins. And once, half buried in the mud near the old clubhouse, I found Gerald's whole binder. Its pages were ruined, letters bleeding into each other, but I recognized the minutes, the budgets, the signatures, proof of everything that had been lost to arrogance. Gerald himself was gone. After his arrest, word spread that he'd taken a plea deal. Fraud, negligence, reckless endangerment. They stacked the charges until he cracked. Some said he'd get 5 years. Others said 10. But the truth was, no sentence could match the punishment of watching everything he'd built crumble into a swamp. Sometimes at night, I swore I still heard him, his voice echoing through the reeds, shouting about property values, about order, about control. And then I'd realize it wasn't him at all. It was the creek. The creek was alive again. That was the strangest part. For all the destruction, all the death, the creek had never looked more beautiful. It flowed with a strength I hadn't seen since childhood, rushing and roaring, carving new paths where concrete had once strangled it. Fish darted through the current. Birds returned, nesting in the trees along its banks. Frogs sang louder than ever. It was as if the land had waited, biding its time, and now that it had won, it was celebrating. And I, madman or witness, was the only one left to hear it. One evening, As summer bled into autumn, I felt the swamp pulling me deeper. The air was thick, heavy with humidity that clung to my skin. The water shimmered in the fading light, gold and red and black all at once. I sat on what remained of my porch, lantern burning low, notebook on my lap. I wrote, "The swamp is not my enemy. The creek is not my curse. They are reminders. They are teachers. They show us what happens when we forget our place, when we think we own what can never be owned." As I wrote, I heard it again, that gurgling laugh beneath the water, louder this time, almost like words. I froze, pen in hand. "Is someone there?" I whispered. The reeds rustled. The creek bubbled. And for a moment, I swear the swamp answered. Not in English, not in words, but in something deeper, something primal. It told me, "You are not the last. You are the first." The hair on my arms rose. My breath caught. I stood, lantern shaking in my grip, staring out into the dark. The swamp stretched before me, endless and alive. The trees swayed, the water rippled, the frogs croaked in a chorus that felt orchestrated. It wasn't random noise. It was a voice, 1,000 voices, and I realized this wasn't just reclamation. This was rebirth. The HOA had tried to bury the creek. They thought they could silence it with concrete, erase it for profit. But nature doesn't die. It waits. It remembers. And when it returns stronger, hungrier, unstoppable. The swamp wasn't punishing us. It was replacing us. The days that followed blurred again, but differently this time. I stopped keeping track of time in hours or dates. Instead, I marked it by the growth of cattails, the return of herons, the sound of crickets. I lived simpler now. Rainwater collected in barrels, fish caught in nets strung across the creek, firewood from trees that had fallen into the water. My house, half sunk and mold-ridden, was no longer a house. It was a shelter, a watchtower, a reminder that I was human in a place that had decided humans were no longer necessary. Sometimes I'd climb onto the roof and watch the sunset stretch across the swamp, endless and wild. I'd close my eyes and listen to the chorus, the creek roaring, the frogs singing, the insects buzzing. And I'd wonder if this was how the land had sounded 100 years ago, before asphalt, before subdivisions, before HOAs and property lines. Other times, the swamp frightened me. Like the night I woke to find water at my bed's edge, creeping higher, whispering louder. Or the morning I discovered a sinkhole had opened just yards from my porch, swallowing the fence hole. Or the time I saw shadows moving in the reeds, too tall, too strange to be animals. Were they people? Survivors like me? Or was it the swamp itself, walking, testing its new shape? I never found out. The last journal entry I wrote was the hardest. This is not my land anymore. It never was. I thought I could stay, thought I could witness. But the truth is, I am a trespasser now. The swamp has reclaimed what was always its own. My neighbors were forced out by law and loss. I will be forced out by something greater. As I set down my pen, the lantern flickered out. The darkness was complete. And in that darkness, I finally understood. The swamp didn't hate me. It didn't want revenge. It wanted silence. It wanted to be left alone. And so I stood on my porch one last time, looking out at the water that shimmered in the moonlight. I thought of the families who had once filled these streets, the children who had once played here, the lives that had been built and buried. I thought of Gerald, of his arrogance, of his downfall. I thought of myself, stubborn, foolish, unwilling to let go. Then I whispered into the night, "I hear you." And the swamp fell silent. No frogs, no crickets, no wind, just silence. The kind of silence that doesn't surround you, it swallows you. What happened after, I can't say for certain. Some will tell you I finally left, packed what little I had and walked away, leaving the swamp to its victory. Others might believe I stayed, that I was swallowed like the houses, my name added to the whispers that ripple across the water. But the truth doesn't matter. What matters is the story. And the story is this. You can bury a creek. You can silence a river. You can pave and build and profit. But nature will wait. And when it returns, it will not ask for permission. It will take, and it will win. Always.